there could be only one
good Highlander movie.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about Highlander, the original 1986 movie, not the mini sequels that followed and or the series that followed. There was an animated series that had boomerangs and stuff.
Comic books?
I haven't read any of the comics. So we wanted to talk about this because it's urban fantasy before urban fantasy was a thing.
They called it like contemporary fantasy, which is what you see a lot of urban fantasy fall into before
it was a thing.
Yeah, before.
So, it was a thing. And it also just has good fantasy elements. It's got a lot of sword fights, and there's a lot of pedantry that you can assert with the way that they display the sword fights and stuff. Yeah, and there's a lot of white sneakers because it was done in the 80s. So, if you've never seen Highlander, I do recommend you watch it. It's a classic. I actually really still like the movie.
I love it.
There's a bunch of reasons why I like it. Not the least of which is the soundtrack by Queen.
Yes. I feel like we're gonna do this video and people are gonna say, Jay and Stu, you guys hate all these movies. Why do you love a movie that everyone else hates?
It's because it's Highlander.
It's Highlander, and it's the greatest.
It won the Academy Award. Greatest movie ever.
Greatest movie ever.
So, if you've never seen Highlander, I feel like it's one of those movies everyone has to see, whether you like it or hate it, or you find it too cheesy or not. You got to keep in mind something about cheesy is that cheesy occurs in here, right? And when it came out, it wasn't cheesy because it was the first of its kind.
Yeah.
And things only become cheesy once they're imitated and repeated a million times, and then the things become cheesy.
And it's all about
Kenny G's Sweet Licks.
Sweet. It's all about being able to suspend your disbelief, and honestly, I think the soundtrack does a lot to let you be immersed in the world because Queen was such high value at the time.
Yeah, when Queen signed on for when Queen signed on for the project. They were basically like promised the world, and they were really excited to work on the project. And then the movie was actually like a flop domestically.
Yeah.
And so Queen got very, very upset. They were going to call their album, the next album was going to be called Highlander and just tie into the movie and the whole bit. And so they ended up calling the album A Kind of Magic. It's not a bad album. It's actually a pretty good album. It's got a lot of good songs on it. But they were very, very upset over the way that soundtrack worked out, and they vowed like they would never do soundtracks again or something like that. So it didn't work out for them, but the Queen-centered soundtrack is really good, and I think Michael Kamen did the other music in it. I think he did the orchestral score, but I'm not sure. Yeah, Michael Kamen did I have the notes over here. So yeah, Michael Kamen did the orchestral score, and it does pretty well. If you don't know who Michael Kamen was, he did a lot of film scores. He also did the Symphony Metallica project, so he was good at working within popular music confines to create good stuff. So the music's really good. What else is good about it?
I love the fantasy the urban fantasy elements of it because there's weird magic in it. It's not explicit magic. It's not like Gandalf is running around like wielding his staff and.
Yeah, a quick synopsis if you never saw it. I can't imagine anyone hasn't seen it who's watching this, but basically there's people living among us who are immortal. And the way that you kill an immortal is by chopping his head off. And when you chop his head off, you like gain his power, right?
Yeah, it's like Super Cop, but with immortals.
Yeah. And so the plot centers around these immortals, and they're going to New York City to compete for the prize. And we don't really know what the prize is until we get to the end. And the way that you compete is by killing
the rest of the immortals,
killing everybody else, and becoming the last one. The hint: there could be only one. And so. It's an interesting plot, and it's basically this idea of like, what if we took medieval swordsmen and we brought them into the 20th century? What would that be like? And this is something that's been explored in a lot of other medium, like the idea of vampires like living long lives, and what's it like to be immortal and to have witnessed all these different sorts of histories, and what kind of personality does that produce?
Yeah, and so we do like a back and forth from like Renaissance era Scotland back to modern day New York, and it shows this growth of this character, why the character is the way that he is. Connor McLeod goes from peasant warrior to
He goes from like a nobody dirt farmer into like building up massive wealth in New York City and collecting all kinds of artifacts and stuff.
Yeah, so he's got like an antique store or something, and you're just like, oh, this is weird, but he's fabulously wealthy.
Yeah, so acting. Let's go down the list of like the main things that are going to kind of go into it. So acting.
Moderate at best.
What about Sean Connery?
Sean Connery saves the whole project.
Sean Connery was paid $1 million for 1 day of work on this film, and I actually think that $1 million was well invested.
It was worth it.
He's so convincing. The way he delivers the dialogue is great. Christopher Lambert is the lead in the movie, and I actually find him generally unconvincing. Other than he has this weird stare where it's like,
yeah, it's this.
They like really focus on this like very intimidating stare that he had.
I think the old timey version of him, the Scottish version of him, is good. He does a great job there. But as soon as he's in New York, he's a little too distant. Yeah, he's too stiff. Is what I was going to say.
And he speaks with a weird accent, and it's not like a Scottish accent. It's a kind of because he's French originally, I think. So he has a weird accent. I don't know. It doesn't. He's very iconic in the role at this point, but if I just look at it from a more objective perspective, I don't think the casting was quite a matchup there.
But he eventually became Raiden.
Yeah.
So that was nice for him.
The girl who plays Roxanne Hart. Yeah. She's okay, but she has kind of a like melodramatic stage presence kind of thing. Like she's used to acting on stage. Yeah. Like, and this is something, if you take somebody who's like a Broadway actor and you put them in a movie, they look like they're overacting all the time. Because when you're on stage, people are seeing you physically and you're this big. Yeah. You gotta do
really
stuff.
Emote.
So she's like a little bit over emotive. So the acting's okay. Clancy Brown is the bad guy. I thought he was great as the bad guy.
He was great, yeah.
And it's mostly his voice, where he has this like growling, death metal voice the entire time.
Like, and he dresses the part too.
It's like, it's better to burn out than to fade away. You know, it's just like this this angry voice the whole time, and I think it actually works pretty well. So the acting. What about the dialogue?
Dialogue's kind of bad.
A lot of the dialogue is what I call functional, meaning it's like it tells you what's happening without showing you what's happening. Yeah. And this is something that it happens a lot in screenplays where it's really hard. You're really afraid the audience is missing what you're going to show.
Yeah, so there's a lot of tell them with dialogue.
Yeah, you tell them in dialogue. Like, so there's a part where like they're like matching up the signatures, and they just come out and say, "This guy's been around for 400 years." It's like we already know that as the audience, but it's like we have to like make it extra explicit.
Yeah, you're watching it happen, and if you're following along, then you know what happens. Yeah. But it's this kind of thing that people expect audiences to be really lazy. So they put this extra layer of explanation on the top.
They did that in the Warcraft movie where they stop in the throne room and explain the plot so far to another character. It's like, we don't need that. Yeah. So there's a lot of functional dialogue. There's a lot of dialogue that says what you should be able to perceive by watching. So there's a lot of tell instead of show. A lot of the dialogue, for the time, for the 1980s, I think a lot of it fits into the 1980s, and a lot of it 30 years later, it's kind of stupid, but you take the good and the bad. So it averages mostly to be kind of bad. But again, when we have the dialogue that's like in the past, I think it's a lot better.
I think it works. It just works really well.
I think it works a lot better than whatever reason. I felt like the contemporary setting was the part that ended up being cheesy and lame, not the historical settings.
Well, and
the
what's
historical settings were very fascinating.
Is it starts out at like a pro wrestling.
It starts.
Fight.
Yeah, the opening scene.
Well,
it starts with this opening scene, this crawl that's narrated by Sean Connery very effectively.
Yeah,
we have always been among you, carrying out many secret lives. Blah 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 blah, traveling down through the centuries to meet time of the gathering. It's really effective. And then you have this big song by Queen. You're like, yeah, and then it fades into a wrestling ring. And you're like,
yeah, it's like, man, fantasy.
And then wrestlers.
Oh wait, make believe. Okay.
Yeah, it's like wrestlers. So, but wrestling was like such an iconic '80s thing. I don't know. It's like they were trying to package the '80s
into one thing.
They're like, we need a really good representation of New York in 1985 or '86, whenever they shot it.
It's like a time capsule.
Like we need
New York
white sneakers. Wrestling, pro wrestling,
Porsches.
The guy in the guy who's a gun nut carrying around like 50 guns in his car.
Yeah.
Like they did a bunch of really bizarre decisions for that.
Yeah, and I think it was really to really peg. You wanted to make sure that you knew that the time periods were different, but that was really obvious because you're talking like 400 or 500 years of time distance.
So I like the story though. I think the story's good.
The plot I like a lot.
Yeah, I think the plot works great, and I think you have this kind of interrupting stuff with flashbacks that inform the character. I thought that was really, really effective, and so there's a lot of good techniques that were used in the movie as well. So I think that's worth noting. There's a lot of effectiveness. The sets, I think the historical sets work pretty well. One of the things that they did that I noticed is the interior shots are pretty close and could have been shot in any set. And then you see the castle in the background and they're outdoors, like getting ready to fight a battle. They did do a little bit of the whole, these people are medieval, therefore they're covered in dirt kind of thing, which isn't, it's not that it's that inaccurate. It's just, they're like, well, back in the Renaissance, Scottish Highlands, I bet it's really dirty. So they just made everyone kind of dirty and like
I
covered
think
with stuff.
That's really like a film trope at this point,
Back then, it probably wasn't as much of a film trope. Although, like, we watched Monty Python, and it's like Monty Python just went full bore with it.
Yeah.
Oh, there's some lovely muck over here, and they're like just piling up mud
on top of themselves.
Yeah, and they're just like putting mud on themselves because like that's what medieval peasants were. They were just like dirty and filthy all the time, right? Wearing rags.
Now we see the violence inherent to the system.
So like Monty Python like made light of it back in the late 70s.
Yeah.
And so we have a little bit more of it here. I do like the historical costumes and set pieces. I think they work. Yeah. Do we want to do weapon and armor pedantry?
Let's be pedants about it.
All right, so we're talking about the setting mostly, right?
Yeah.
So there's a couple things. First of all, you have you definitely have like full bore Cult of the Katana thing going on, where Ramirez's sword is this Masamune, and he tells the story that like he married Masamune's daughter, but his daughter was a princess. Masamune, he lived in like the 14th century, but when Ramirez told it, he lived like before Christ, and and made this great sword for him, and that's the sword that Ramirez carries, is this ancient Japanese blade.
Expect someone who was a historical Japanese fiction writer to be reviewing the movie.
Yeah, but it's like it's cool that they brought that in there, but at the same time, it's like the Masamune, it's just the fact that he uses a katana instead of I don't know, a rapier or something. I guess if you have to sever a head, a katana might be a good choice.
Yeah,
because it's like it's good at cutting things, right?
At least in D&D, a rapier is a piercing weapon,
and
whereas a katana would be a slash.
Yeah, you actually wouldn't use a rapier. That's correct. You probably wouldn't use a rapier for this scenario. You'd use a katana or something that's very good at severing a head, like a good arming sword or a long sword or something like that. And the villain uses a long sword
that he pulls out of this suitcase,
kind of puts it together like a fishing rod.
It's like
that wouldn't hold together. It was completely retarded that.
And then it gets two little prongs at the end.
Yeah, he pulls it up and it's like, psh, and they're like, oh, that's a cool little shot.
Yeah, that's cool. And
but the prongs wouldn't. Dink. It's like, oh, it's to bind up somebody's blade. It's like you probably don't want somebody's blade bound up against your body.
Yeah,
you want to be able to parry it and then smack them in the head, right?
Yeah.
And so the broadsword, it looks kind of cool. Its proportions are weird. It's clearly extremely
look cool, but
it's clearly extremely heavy. And this is one of the things a lot of people make mistakes about with historical arms, is that they see a big long sword and they're like, God, that's got to be heavy as hell. And they pick it up, they're like, oh, it's only like a couple of pounds. It's like, this is still on the heavy side for a weapon that size. And the thing is, you have to think about someone historically actually trying to wield a weapon. If it's heavy, you're not going to do that much with it. Most people are not gatsu. They can't.
Yeah, well, and you're using it like
this way.
Like this.
So you're not swinging with your
it's not World of Warcraft.
Yeah. So most long swords, you're it's kind of hard to operate. You're hitting it forward by pulling this wrist back. So it's a really
it's a lever.
It's a really really quick strike. A long sword is extremely fast. It's an extremely fast weapon. So when you play World of Warcraft, it's like, cool, 3.5 speed two-hander, and it's like no. What would happen is that the two-handed swords would be faster than the other swords, because for two reasons. First reason is that this is really fast versus this whole arm motion, and it's longer, so therefore you're reaching your target quicker.
Yep.
So the tip is going even faster than what it would normally be. The longer the sword, the faster that tip moves. So if you strike someone at the tip, it's just like burst the head open.
Yeah.
Kind of.
You've got
kind
this
of force.
huge lever, and that's the whole point.
Yeah, it's the point of the leverage, so that you can really hit with it.
Whereas,
But the proportions of the longsword are a little odd. The handle's a little short, so it's kind of like a bastard sword, but it's really long, like a Zweihander or something. It looks cool. It's clearly, when we see the actor using it, it's a prop. It's really heavy, and they actually dealt with this with like Conan the Barbarian. Is that Arnold Schwarzenegger? They're like it was something like he was the only person who could actually use the prop sword because he was the only person strong enough to like move it around. Because it was so heavy.
We got to do Conan next.
We'll do Conan next. Conan the Barbarian, classic fantasy film. But the rest of the cast were all bodybuilders too, and so they had these big oversized weapons. And it's like, if anyone was going to use those, it'd be those dudes. But historical people weren't like...
They weren't bodybuilders.
Yeah, they weren't bodybuilders. They weren't that
Which
big.
we could talk about that too.
Yeah, so anyway, I like to be a pedant about that. Also, the Kurgans armor during the battle. He has the snake helm, which just looks super cool, right?
Yeah.
But you're like, oh, cool, a snake helm. But you realize, like...
It's not really protecting him.
It's not protecting him from anything. It's mostly just like blinding him while doing nothing.
Well, and really,
but the armor does look really cool.
It's like the opposite of what we talked about in World of Warcraft with the lion helm, where it's like, look how pretty the actor is.
Like this.
It was really like he's not that attractive looking, so we want to make the prop look really cool. So it's like I'm doing like a Vayne impression here.
Yeah, and that's
Bane.
Yeah. So and then like the castles are all already pretty ruined.
Yeah.
Which. They shot with real castles, but so they looked a little old. But overall, like that's my pedantry. Also, like sword abuse that other people have talked about on YouTube. So like you see a point where like Kurgan's dragging his sword, and just like sparks are going. It's like, why would you dull your weapon before you intend to use it to chop someone's head off? There's a lot of stuff like that. A lot of this.
It's like the Indiana Jones thing. He's.
yeah, I love that. I did love that in Indiana Jones. What else was there? Oh yeah, the very first fight, the guy is using. He's using a one-handed sword in the first fight, and it is. I don't remember if it's a rapier or not. I think it's not a rapier. I don't remember, but it's a big basket-hilted. Doodad, right? And it's like, oh, that's actually would be pretty cool, but he looks totally lame when he does it. And they have a part where he's like flipping around. Like there's a lot of cringe.
Yeah, just like acrobatic weirdness. Like
why would you do
that?
The
lights
would do that.
The lights go off and he's backflipping through this car garage.
Yeah. He's like, why would you? It's like, I need to get away. Let me backflip
away.
Like, why would you do that? So yeah, let's talk about the cringe.
That's a big one.
So let's go let's hit all the cringe.
Okay.
Wrestling. The wrestling is totally cringy because you see 80 wrestlers with like their body fat.
Well, it's like Ric Flair, and you got all these old school guys.
Yeah.
It's on screen pretty briefly, but
it's pretty cringe.
Yeah.
And why is Connor McLeod, the ancient warrior, going to a wrestling match?
Yeah. Why is he
Madison Square Garden?
Well, honestly, the only reason I could think of would be to look for this other immortal, which he ends up finding.
Yeah.
So maybe this other guy was really into pro wrestling, and I'm going to just assume that Connor McLeod has way more class.
What would you know about a 18th century Salamanca sword? That's the police detective who I actually liked. I thought he was very effective in it. And so that was cringe number 1. Then you have him backflipping through the thing, which was cringe number 2. What are some other cringies?
I think the love scene towards the end where he was a little cringy, where they're sitting in like that circular lowered seating area.
Yeah.
And she's like convincing Connor to like come out
and he has her like stab him.
Oh yeah, that was kind of cringy.
That's totally gonna get her into bed, right?
Yeah. A lot of
the police scenes are a little cringy. So like they have this guy. He's like chewing gum, right?
This is now an ASMR video.
Yeah, he's like, "You faggot, Nash." It's like, oh my god, this is so 80s. And he goes, "Why, you looking for a piece of ass?" And he says it with like his weird accent. It's just like, Okay. The police detective is a cliche, but I think he works. The gun nut is a total cringe the entire time. Yeah. He's like, I have all these guns and I ain't safe. It's like, oh yeah, he's a crazy Vietnam veteran. It's like nobody drives around with like a bunch of machine guns on their car seat.
Unless you're like Sam and Dean Winchester from Supernatural.
Yeah, I don't know. So it was really stupid that they just put him
more
in there.
Urban fantasy.
And then like the Kurgans, Kurgans. None of the Kurgan stuff is all that cringy. There's a lot of cringe in the movie. The white sneakers are cringe.
I'm thinking no, it's not cringe, but there's a part where the Kurgan rapes
a prostitute.
No, he rapes McLeod's wife, and that's not cringy, but it's actually pretty effective.
It's actually pretty effective. Change that to
effective.
Makes the character more brutal. They aren't afraid to have bad guys be really bad.
And he's really bad.
Yeah, he's a bad guy. And then like they have a really good reveal where like they're sitting in the church and he's like, she never told you.
Yeah.
It wasn't Ramirez's woman. It was your woman.
Yeah. That's brutal. And that's one of the things that they don't hold your hand for it. And that's part of the reason I like this movie is this happens and Connor never talks about it happening because she never tells him. And then later in the future, the bad guy reveals to him and it creates like this, I have to kill this motherfucker.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's also some cringe moments with some of the fighting where it's like the Kurgan spinning in circles, bashing stuff with the sword, and like the letters are falling down, and on the surface you're like, well, this is like this epic scene, but like 30 years later you're just kind of like, that looks really dumb.
Yeah.
Probably at the time it was more effective. I think that might be true for a lot of different stuff. Then there's a lot of really effective things. We mentioned the rape thing being really, really effective. All of the scenes with Ramirez are really, really effective.
Spanish peacock.
Yeah, if we're talking about the characters, like Ramirez really, Sean Connery's character really has a big impact. You end up really liking him because he's kind of like the sage in this like hero's journey that is Connor McLeod, and he teaches him what he needs to know, teaches him how to not suck at using a sword. And then when he dies, like Connor uses Ramirez's sword and leaves his sword behind because he's leaving himself behind. He's leaving the McLeod name behind. And that's I think that was all insight, really, really effective. And they didn't hold your hand on that part. They hold your hand on other things, which are kind of dumb. But like he leaves the McLeod sword like in his wife's grave and leaves himself behind and goes on to be other things in history. And then I thought it was really effective. You kind of see all these little scenes from history, and you kind of left wanting more of them. Yeah. There's a part where he's in he's reminiscing with this other immortal with this duel in France.
Right.
Where he gets drunk and this guy challenges him to a duel and they're having a small sword duel and the guy's like stabs him over and over again and he's not dying and he just apologizes at the end.
Yeah.
which was really, really funny.
He's like totally drunk the whole time.
Yeah.
And
he's like, I apologize to you, And then at the end of it, the whoever was dueling him, he shoots his second with a pistol.
Yeah,
which was really bizarre.
Yeah,
but it was it worked. There was a lot of those scenes that I thought worked. There's one when France, you see his like secretary he saves from the Nazis. Right, he falls on top of her during some part of the war. The Nazi shoots him, and then he doesn't die.
And he surprises the secretary. He's like.
He tells her, and she's like, "Why aren't you dead?" And he goes, "It's a kind of magic," and that becomes one of the Queen songs from the film. That inspired the Queen song, and so he gets up and shoots the Nazi, and so we get to see him be a good guy in a sense, and not be. It would have been, he couldn't be a Nazi and the West like him, so he had to be someone not a Nazi. But all those I thought were pretty effective. I thought most of the fight choreography was good.
It was good stage choreography,
for what it is, right?
Yeah. You're left feeling excited, and there's tension. There's lots of like blade on blade, like not attacks. But,
you attack the sword instead of the person, right? The final one in particular, they like really did a bunch of things. I assume they storyboarded this out to try to ramp it up. They did a bunch of things to try to up up the tension at the end and make it longer. So it starts off with this fight on the rooftop. The Kurgan goes like on this whirlwind spinning spree, and like a water
tower,
tank. And so everything's filled up with water. There's electricity. They fall through this glass into this empty warehouse for some reason, underneath the Silver Cup sign. And then they fight in the empty warehouse finally.
Just by like the moonlight, and it's really good looking.
And while they're fighting, when they finally get down to the bottom, that's when the music starts for the final fight. So that's another effective thing that they do. And then he cuts his head off, and then they have the really
it's like this
special
crazy
effects.
like tattoo drawing like coming out of his head, and
it's very 80s special effects.
Yeah.
It's as good as you were going to get in the 80s. Today it looks bad. And what you'd probably do if you were going to have like a director special editions, they'd probably redo those special effects. Yeah. Most people are like, oh, I don't want them to redo special effects like this. Yeah, but some special effects were just not good back in the day.
They're so dated. And
it's not like we're cutting out a puppet and replacing him with a bad-looking piece of CG.
Or we're getting rid of shotguns and replacing them with walkie-talkies.
Yeah, we're cutting out bad-looking special effects and replacing them with good CGI. That's what that final scene would really need, I think, in a special edition. So overall, it's good. I think the characters are born out of the setting for the most part pretty properly. I think, although the New York scenes with Christopher Lambert in them weren't that effective, I think he was going for like, what would a dude who's 400 years old really act like? Yeah,
and he is very aloof, which I think is good. It's expected that makes sense for that character.
Yeah,
but he's too flat.
Yeah, he's a little too flat. His effect is a little flat.
And I think that's okay because they do so much characterization of him in the past that you're not, kind of so that you see him in the future and you're like, everyone he's ever loved is dead, and you see these two characters that he grows relationships with. One is the old woman secretary who's 200 years younger than he is.
Yeah.
But and then you see the she's a museum curator, or is she, what is?
Yeah, so she's she works for a museum.
That was a cringe.
She's a metal expert. So this is a cringe one.
Yeah.
There's a couple like history cringe moments, right? And she's like, she pulls this steel like out of this cut in the concrete, and she's like, this steel's been folded over 200 times.
Was it only 200? I thought she said 4,000 or something.
Yeah, but the thing is, 4,000 is not that many layers for Damascus steel. Because just like doubling a grain of rice, you fold it once, you're like, oh, there's 2 layers. You fold it twice, there's 4 layers. 8.
Exponentially.
16, 32. Before you know it, if you've only folded it so many times, you have thousands of layers, right? You could even get to millions of layers if you keep doing it. And the whole point of Damascus steel is it's to make the steel more consistent. So she's like, oh, this is like finding a 747 in the Bronze Age or something like that. It's like, actually, Damascus steel goes back really far, so that's not quite like that. But it has to do with them deciding that Masamune lived before Christ rather than in the 14th century when he actually lived.
And I guess that's fine for a fantasy setting. To go ahead and explain why you think that. As opposed to just getting it completely wrong.
Yeah, the other thing some people have taken exception with is the carved hilt of the katana that looks like a dragon, but there's actually historical examples of that, and that kind of inspired when I wrote Muramasa, Blood Drinker, Japanese historical fiction. I actually had the hilt of his sword have a carving of a dragon in it to represent like the demon that was within the sword and within him. There actually are some examples of that, but most of the time you bought a blade and it didn't have the handle. You could put whatever handle you wanted on the blade. The blade maker made just the metal and didn't even polish it. You took it to a different dude to polish it, different dude to make the hilt and the scabbard, different. A whole setting of a sword or a daisho, a set of swords, was not made by one smith. It was made by multiple people, and that smith probably had a bunch of burly apprentices doing all the hammering anyway. Where he's like, "This is hot enough, hammer it, guys. Good." Let me put it back in the forge. I'm gonna get some sake.
But I think the thing that people don't like about that I could see as being awkward is it's so big that it's got to affect the weight of that sword.
Yeah,
it's got to affect the weight of that sword.
Yeah, it's probably, I don't know. there's historical examples of more ornate hilts, but
I believe it. But were they used?
Probably not. They're probably for display.
Not.
You know, you're probably right. So probably not. But I
it's
think
cool for cinema.
There's also like the 80s computer parts where it's like things are operating in ways that don't make any sense for a computer. They just do it for display purposes. Whereas they have a dude. Why does it have to be so cold in here? Yeah, it's good for the circuits.
It's good.
A lot of things in the movie didn't age well. But if you look at it as just like the parts that don't age well are just like a fun relic from the 80s.
It's like a time capsule.
Yeah, then I think it's actually a lot of fun to see some of those elements because you create things at the time that you don't realize are not going to age well. Mm-hmm. And there's probably a bunch of examples from every single like film era that are just that. And the 80s just had a lot of them. They had a lot of cliches in the action film department.
Yeah. I mean, if we ever talk about Blade Runner's really got a good example of that, where you're looking into the future from the 1980s and you're seeing things like
low-res photography
or CRT
TVs. Yeah,
you know?
Same thing with Johnny Mnemonic and those CRT TVs. I don't know. Is there much else to say?
I think that's. I mean, well, we didn't dive terribly deep into the plot, but I think it's because we want you to watch the movie.
Yeah, it's a good movie. The plot's pretty basic. They're at the gathering. Everybody has to die except for one dude. It comes down to Connor and the Kurgan, the bad guy and the good guy. And they even set it up. It's like you can't let the Kurgan win the prize because mankind will suffer an eternity of darkness. Yeah. And it's like we don't know what the prize is till he gets it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about so there could be only one good Highlander movie. There's a bunch of sequels. This movie was not made with sequels in mind. That's very apparent when you get to the end. However, for whatever reason, it captured enough of a cult following and enough of an audience that was really interested in this idea of immortal swordsmen like living among us that it spawned at least three other movies. At least 3 other movie sequels and a series. And so the series was on TNT or TBS back in the 1990s. And it had another McLeod.
Which was like his son?
No, it was like his nephew. I don't know. Another McLeod who was having his own adventures. And in order to walk that back, they just said like, he didn't really kill the last one in the movie.
Yeah, it was... Well, and didn't they do that in the second one where there were aliens?
They were like... So, okay. Yeah, there's so much to talk about with all the sequels.
Well, see, I didn't watch any of the other ones because I love the first one so much that
I warned you away from them.
Yeah, David really warned me away from them.
Highlander 2, The Quickening, is one of the most hated sequels in the history of Hollywood, and we could maybe do a whole show just on that.
We'd have to watch it because I would have to watch it and ruin my life. Ruin how much I love Highlander.
So it goes way to the future where Connor McLeod is like watching over Earth as its guardian, and then there's sword fights with aliens. Turns out everybody's from the planet Zeist or something. I think planet Zeist. They're all aliens. Ramirez comes back and they fly around space with swords, like chopping up bird-headed aliens and stuff. There's actually a lot of cool scenes in Highlander 2, and it's a really original idea. It's like, where do we go from here? It's like, aliens, right? Like they just went full bore like into the stratosphere, and fans didn't like it. Fans hated it, but it created the series back in our modern times rather than like the distant future, where you got to have more sword fights and more little plots and whatever people wanted. And then it kind of built up a different set of mythology that really wasn't there in the first movie at all. Where you have all these other different factions. You have a faction of people who just like watch the fights for some reason, or I don't know. It gets weird. By the time you get to then they have Highlander 3, which was just called Highlander. Was it Highlander? What was it called?
Highlander.
Not Highlander Endgame. Highlander Endgame was the 4th or 5th one.
Not gonna watch it here.
It was originally called Highlander 3: The Sorcerer. It's had like 8 different names. It had like Mario Van Peebles in it, and he's imprisoned in a cave and he gets out and they fight and he's a sorcerer and like the Masamune breaks and he reforges it, and people considered it like that's the real sequel to the original Highlander movie, and it's like it's not that good, guys, and it just goes downhill from there. And by the time you get to Highlander Endgame, you're like, what am I watching? You know, because it starts to build so heavily on the series and the popularity of the series.
Yeah.
And the budget goes down, and The cinematography begins to look more like telegraphy, like it's for a television show. I don't know. So I would say watch the first one and skip all the others. You can watch Highlander 2 if you want something really weird and bad, I guess. So that's the sequels. A lot of people, it spawned a whole franchise, and I think it's important to talk about it for urban fantasy because I think it was very influential on what
it was
following.
Definitely, because you see this weird kind of magic, but it's not.
It's not
your
as
understanding
explicit.
of the real world is just. It's just turned like 90 degrees.
Yeah, it's just
so
a little
you
bit
still
off.
see the real world for what it is, but then you start having these different explanations for things. You see historical events differently. You see
and I think
characters' abilities.
I think that's one of the things that urban fantasy does. It has a great appeal about it is that you have a world that we're familiar with, but we're introducing unfamiliar concepts into that world and seeing how those interact. And so this was a really, really good example of that. And I think would prove influential on a lot of the things that followed from it. So anyway, that's probably it.
Yeah, let's call it there.
You can find me at dvspress.com, davidvstewart.com. All the links for my books will be down below in the description. You can pre-order my newest book, Water of Awakening, over at Amazon. That helps me out. It's a 99-cent pre-order. The price will probably go up. So get it while you can for cheap, and I, of course, really, really appreciate it.
You can find me at matthewjwellman.com. My new book, Immortal Fear, an urban fantasy mystery thriller, is going to be out on July 14th. And if you join my mailing list, the first 100 people to join that mailing list are going to get an advanced copy of that.
Yeah.
Links will be down.
So yeah, if you want an advanced copy of Water of Awakening, email me, stu at dvspress.com, and I will send you the link for the advanced copy stuff. And if you're on my regular mailing list, or if you want to get on my regular mailing list, please do that, and I will. All the links will be down below, and I'll send you a free book for getting on that mailing list too very soon.
Free books, both sides.
Yeah, we'll get free books. So you guys have a great one, and we'll see you next time.
Later.
This has been Riders of the Dawn.